Welcome to the TDS Early Years podcast. Now, each week we're going to be joined by different educational experts from across the globe who are going to offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help us as practitioners unlock all the potential for learning that there is in the early years. So to be first to hear about future episodes and to access all of the follow-up content, including ideas for your own setting, Pinterest, mood boards, and loads more, you can sign up for exclusive access using the link in our podcast description. Hello, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and I am your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an early years consultant, trainer, and author. In the first series of the TTS Talking Early Years podcast, we're going to explore the amazing adventures that you can have in outdoor learning in the early years. And I'm going to be talking to a number of global experts who will inspire your everyday work and unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Now, today I'm joined by Niki Buchan, who's a nature pedagogy expert and general inspiration, and also a very good friend of mine. Welcome, Niki.
Thank you, Alistair.
Now, for those people who haven't come across you, and there must only be a few, can you just tell me a bit about who you are and what you do and what's led you to be on this podcast?
Well, I was asked to come on the podcast. That's what led me to be on the podcast. But I'm originally from South Africa, and then I'm very passionate about the outdoors and about nature. And I was very lucky. I spent 10 years in the UK, and then I was invited to come and work in Australia, which is a totally different nature. I had to get used to lots of different animals, lots of different kinds of risks, and but it's kept me very excited about the whole nature pedagogy. And the more time I spend in nature, the more I think every child deserves this. We need to bring all the children out here, because I'm still so excited, and I'm very old now, but I'm still excited about what I find in nature.
Yeah, and Niki and I have worked together on numerous occasions, both in the UK and in Australia, which has been fantastic. And one of the things I love about you is you're not that old, but your passion for children and the rights of children and their right to experience nature, it never dies. And that's why working with you and listening to you when you talk and reading the work that you write is so impactful and infectious, because you believe it. It's, you've got that fire in your belly, and it's great. So if anybody hasn't come across Niki's work, we'll put some links in this podcast to various bits of Niki's work in access, but you can also just Google her in this day of modern technology, and lots of things will come up that will be interesting. So in this first episode, we're just going to try and dive into the value of nature-based pedagogy. So again, that might be a term that is unfamiliar to lots of people that are listening. So can we start off by just saying, for you, what if you had to give nature-based pedagogy or a definition, what would that be?
It's basically nature-based pedagogy is a nature-based practice, trying to work in nature with children, or I talk about working in and with nature and with the children. So just a very natural space for children to be. And I think one of the big benefits for children, or that I see for children, is so many children today are struggling, with mental health issues. And since COVID, we've had a massive increase in children with mental health issues. In Australia, they said it's doubled, if not tripled, the number of children with mental health issues. So, when I last looked at the statistics for the UK, it was also very high figures for children with mental health issues. And, I know that when I'm stressed or anxious, the place I go to recharge and recover is outside. I never choose to go to a busy shopping centre.
No, when you're talking about children with mental health issues and that kind of raising anxiety, which has been some studies around that as well in very young children, so we're talking about early years children here. I think also we've got to think about the people who are their primary carers. So that might be a parent or a carer, but also a practitioner who's going to be working with and looking after those children. If your mental health isn't good, and obviously, then you are in a different place when it comes to your interactions with children. And I think you're dead right. What I love about a kind of more outdoors or nature-based approach to early years pedagogy is that it gets adults out in that space as well. And so you get that kind of secondary benefit for the adult, because they're not only watching children thrive, but also getting that benefit from being outside themselves.
Definitely. And I think a lot of adults have lost their connection to nature. So by taking the children out, and that's part of their job, then they suddenly realize that actually we're enjoying it. And so often I find the adults say to me, this was, the children usually come and say, this is the best day of my life. And the adults say, I felt superfluous. I had nothing to do. And I think, what a magic combination. And then why don't we just do it every day? If that is so wonderful, why do we restrict it? Why do we have the indoors as, the default place for children to be, when actually the outdoors offer so much more?
Exactly. I think that's a really valid point, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in one of our future episodes, the idea that a lot of how we perceive quality childcare and education to take place is in an indoor space where the adult is often very much in control, but the children are quite restricted in their choice. And what's brilliant about nature-based learning is that it offers lots of opportunities for interpretation. So, when give a child a truck, you've given them a truck. But when you give them a natural space that's full of sticks and leaves and twigs and seeds and all sorts of things, then they can interpret that space. And as an adult, you've got loads more opportunity to scaffold and support that learning.
What you've mentioned about the practitioners, I think is very important, because if the practitioners haven't got high levels of well-being and etc., that they can't give the children the best. And especially children that are struggling. So, all the more reason to go outside. And the research shows that when you go outside, your stress levels drop. And also that the more time you spend outside, the bigger the benefits. So, it's great if we can do it for 2 hours a week, but it would be even better if we could do it for a longer period of time or more often than once a week. Because, where did that come from, that we do it once a week? It can also be more often.
Yeah, I think in the UK particularly, there is a big push around forest schools education, and people become forest schools trained. And obviously not everybody's got a copse or a forest at the end of, whatever setting they particularly work in. But one of the things that really struck me has been very different when I came out and worked with you in Australia, and we did kind of bush kindy, where you've got very young children who are going out into the bush to experience nature-based pedagogy. It felt like forest schools that I'd experienced a lot in the UK literally ramped up about 300% because of what the children were able to access, let alone the fact that there might be poisonous animals and snakes and spiders. And again, for somebody who was passionate about outdoor learning, that also took me way out of my comfort zone as a practitioner, thinking, I get being outside and I get being outside in nature, where you might get wet and you might get cold and the sun might shine. But when you're suddenly saying we're climbing big trees and we're four, or we are, I remember marching down to Bush Kindy and the children singing and marching and stamping their feet, and me saying to a child that we were with, this is a great song. And he was like, yeah, we do it to frighten the snakes. And when a 4-year-old says that, you're like, pardon? And that's when I learned that snakes can't hear, but they can feel vibration. Because I think you might have said to me, if you scream at a snake, it makes no odds because it won't slither away. But if you stamp and you vibrate. So suddenly you're thinking, right, I'm out with some very young children, carrying a portaloo, going down to a creek by a massive bank where we're stamping our feet in case there might be snakes. Then it does take nature-based pedagogy on a whole other level. But what also struck me was it was perfectly doable. And the children were massively able to risk assess. They were really aware of the benefits and the risks of the environment. But what they got out of that in terms of their self-esteem, they were able to stretch their own thinking. They were able to challenge themselves with really sensitive adults who were scaffolding and supporting, was just magical to see. And it made me think, just like you said before, all children need this. Because if everybody had this as a child, you would grow up to be adults with a very different view of the world.
Yep. And I think, we all say we see children as capable and competent. In Australia, I know it's in everybody's philosophy, and in the UK as well. And so often I go to a service and I go, do you really? Because I can't see see that you see the children as capable and competent. It's too structured. You don't allow them to self-risk assess. And children have to learn to self-risk assess. And I always say the only way we can help to keep children safe is to teach them to keep themselves safe. because we're not always going to be there. So children need to know about what the dangers are and how to mitigate those dangers. And so all the risk assessments and things we do are done with the children. Like you say, with the snakes, the children know, we're not just doing a dance, we're doing a dance because there might be snakes. And the same with the UK. If there's a river and it's been raining, which is 90% of the time in the UK, then you would say, or Scotland anyway, where I was working, you would say, well, it might be slippery on the bank, so we won't go too close to the edge. So not just stay away from the edge, it's about the thinking behind it, why we have to stay away from the edge.
And again, I think that's about also building expectations and adults' own ability to be comfortable with that kind of predictive risk assessment you might do in advance, where you say, I'm going to go to this space, these are the risks I see. But that idea of dynamic risk assessment that happens in the moment, that's, you're making a decision about what you see in front of you. And I think that's all about how we as practitioners build up our confidence and knowledge over time. But the only way that we can do that is by putting ourselves in the situations where we can do that, which means going outside.
Yep. And I think one of the biggest impacts, positive impacts we've had on taking children outside, especially into a natural space, is the work of David Ball, Tim Gill, and Bernard Spiegel, where they started looking at the benefits of risk taking, and not to think catastrophically. So, doing a risk assessment and then you weighing up what's the likelihood. We're all very good catastrophic thinkers.
So if we think about nature-based pedagogy in a kind of use case that, like, you worked for a lot of years in Scotland, where it was often really cold as it is, and midges were probably more of an issue than snakes. But for people who are thinking about this, who are maybe in inner city settings or settings throughout the UK, we're not necessarily saying that nature-based pedagogy can only happen if you're in the woods or in the bush or down by a river. Nature-based pedagogy can happen when you're literally just outside of the door. Yes,
it can. And it can also, even at a pinch, it can happen, or at a push, it can happen indoors. So, it would be idyllic if everybody had access to, beautiful meadows and flowing rivers and beautiful forests, rainforests, any kinds of forests. But the reality is very few of us actually do have access to those spaces. So we don't want to deprive those children that don't have access to that. And one of the things I look at is, when I watch children in nature, especially in a forest, but in nature or outdoors, I see that, issues with behavior reduce. The children that are challenging or considered challenging inside the classroom are very often the leaders in the outdoors. Yeah. That's their time to shine. And I think every child deserves to shine, and every child deserves to get that feeling that, I'm valued, I'm good at something, and not a child in an indoor space. And a lot of children don't cope indoors. For whatever reason, a lot of children don't cope indoors. And if those children don't get to use the outside, they're not going to get their chance to shine.
I think we talk repeatedly in this podcast series about the fact that if you look at the usual typical development of children, especially in the early years, it's a physical development. You can only learn to control your body when you've explored what your body can do. And sitting on a chair or sitting in a mat space and being sedentary is not how we are biologically programmed as human beings. So therefore, it makes perfect sense that some children, lots of them, will struggle with being in that kind of very controlled indoor space. And then it all becomes about adults trying to control children to meet the kind of expectation of behavior, when actually, if we thought about the typical development of children and had more developmentally appropriate environments, we would spend a lot more time outside, and our indoors would probably look very different as well, because we've been meeting the needs of children, not trying to get children to meet the needs of the education system that's going to come later. But that's a whole different podcast.
But I think that we need to remember that, because that's one of the reasons we take the children outside, because the learning that happens outside is phenomenal. And especially for those children that have, that display behaviors that challenge the practitioners inside, when you take them outside, those behaviors change or they're not there. And those children are thriving in that space. And the educators, I think that's why educators say, I felt like I had nothing to do, because they didn't have to sit on the children and make them do what they wanted them to do, or what they thought they should be doing.
And that's because that element of high-level engagement that you get with children is what links directly into their progress, their attainment, their interest, and that's what the outdoors can give you. At which point is a really good place to stop this episode and say, in the next episode, I'm going to grill Niki a little bit more about when we are engaged in that nature-based pedagogy, what sort of things do children benefit from it? What sort of things do they learn? So join us in the next episode. And thank you, Niki, for joining us for this one.
Thank you very much.
So I would just like to say a huge thank you to Niki Buchan for joining us and providing such brilliant insights into nature-based pedagogy throughout the world. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and of course with the wonderful Niki Buchan. If you've been inspired by what we've been talking about today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in the episode notes, and then you'll be the first to hear about any future podcasts, but you can also access some really useful follow-up content, including lots of ideas for your setting and Pinterest boards that will help you shop for nature-based resources.